The Moscow theater hostage crisis, also known as the 2002 Nord OST siege, was the seizure of the crowded Dubrovka theater on 23 October 2002 by 40 to 50 armed Chechens who claimed allegiance to the Islamist militant separatist movement in Chechnya. They took 850 hostages and demanded the withdrawal of Russian forces from Chechnya and an end to the Second Chechen War. The siege was officially led by Musa Barayev. Due to the disposition of the theater, special forces would have had to fight through 30 meters of corridor and attack up a well-defended staircase before they could reach the hall in which the hostages were held. The terrorists also had numerous explosives, with the most powerful in the center of the auditorium, that, if detonated, could have brought down the ceiling and caused in excess of 80% casualties. After a 2.5-day siege and the execution of 2 female hostages, Spetsnaz operators from Federal Security Service Alpha and Vega groups, supported by a Russian Ministry of Internal Affairs SOBR unit, pumped an undisclosed chemical agent into the building's ventilation system and raided it. All 40 of the attackers were killed, presumably while unconscious, with no casualties among Spetsnaz. About 130 hostages died, including 9 foreigners, due to adverse reactions to the gas. All but 2 of the hostages who died during the siege were killed by the toxic substance pumped into the theater to subdue the militants. The use of the gas was widely condemned as heavy-handed, but the American and British governments deemed Russia's actions justifiable. Physicians in Moscow condemned the refusal to disclose the identity of the gas that prevented them from saving more lives. Some reports said the drug naloxone was successfully used to save some hostages. Initial siege. The hostages were seized on 23 October at the House of Culture of State Ball-Bearing Plant No. 1 in the Dubrovka area of Moscow, about 4 kilometers southeast of the Moscow Kremlin. During Act 2 of a sold-out performance of Nord OST a little after 9 p.m., 40 to 50 heavily armed and masked men and women drove in a bus to the theater and entered the main hall firing assault rifles in the air. The black and camouflage-clad Chechens took approximately 850 to 900 people hostage, including members of the audience and performers, among them an MVD general. The reaction of spectators inside the theater to the news that the theater was under terrorist attack was not uniform. Some people remained calm, some reacted hysterically, and others fainted. Some performers who had been resting backstage escaped through an open window and called the police. In all, some 90 people managed to flee the building or hide. The militant leader told the hostages that the attackers had no grudge against foreign nationals and promised to release anyone who showed a foreign passport. Demands. The gunmen were led by Musa Barayev, nephew of slain Chechen rebel militia commander Abba Barayev, and threatened to kill the hostages unless Russian forces were immediately and unconditionally withdrawn from Chechnya. They said the deadline was 1 week, after which they would start killing the hostages. A videotaped statement was acquired by the media in which the gunmen declared their willingness to die for their cause. The statement contained the following text. According to the Kremlin's aide Sergei Yastrzemsky, when they were told that the withdrawal of troops was unrealistic within the short period, that it was a very long process, the terrorists put forward the demand to withdraw Russian troops from anywhere in the Republic of Chechnya without specifying which area it was. The hostage-takers demanded termination of the use of artillery and air forces in Chechnya starting the next day, a halt to the notorious Zakistkar operations, and that President of Russia Vladimir Putin should publicly declare that he was striving to stop the war in Chechnya. By the time of the hostage-taking, the conflict in the embattled republic was killing an average of 3 federal troops daily. Cell phone conversations between the hostages trapped in the building and their family members revealed that the hostage-takers had grenades, mines and improvised explosive devices strapped to their bodies, and had deployed more explosives throughout the theater. The militants used Arabic names among themselves, and the female terrorists wore Arab-style burqa clothes, which are highly unusual in the North Caucasus region. Mufti Ahmad Kadji Shemaev, official leader of Chechnya's Muslims, said he had no information about who the attackers were and condemned attacks on civilians. The pro-Moscow Islamic leader of Chechnya also condemned the attack. All hostages were kept in the auditorium and the orchestra pit was used as a lavatory. The situation in the hall was nervous and it frequently changed depending on the mood of the hostage-takers, who were following reports in the mass media. Any kind of misinformation caused hopelessness among the hostages and new aggression among their captors, who would threaten to shoot hostages and blow up the building. But no major disasters took place during the siege. The gunman let members of the audience make phone calls. One hostage used her mobile phone to plead with authorities not to storm the auditorium, as truckloads of police and soldiers with armored vehicles surrounded the building. First night, the 23rd of October, the attackers released 150 to 200 people, including children, pregnant women, Muslims, some foreign-born theater-goers and people requiring health treatment in the early hours after they invaded. 2 women managed to escape. The terrorists said they were ready to kill 10 hostages for any of their number killed if the security forces intervened. Olga Romanova at 1:30 a.m. Olga Romanova, a 26-year-old civilian acting on her own, entered the theater, crossing the police cordon by herself. She entered the theater and began urging the hostages to stand up to their captors. There was considerable confusion in the auditorium. The terrorists believed she was a Federal Security Service agent and she was shot and killed several seconds later. Romanova's body was later removed from the building by a Russian medical team, incorrectly reported by the Moscow police as the body of the first hostage who was killed while trying to escape. Romanova was described as strong-willed and lived near the theater. It is unknown how she crossed the police lines undetected. Day 2, the 24th of October. The Russian government offered the hostage-takers the opportunity to leave for any third country. The suborned hostages made an appeal, possibly under orders or duress, to Putin to cease hostilities in Chechnya and asked him to refrain from assaulting the building. Because of the crisis, Putin cancelled an overseas trip that would have included meetings with U.S. President George W. Bush and other world leaders. The hostage-takers demanded to talk with Joseph Kobzon, a parliament member and singer, with International Red Cross representatives. 4 people, including a man waving some white fabric like a flag, entered the building about 1:20 p.m. Shortly thereafter, a man in his 60s, appearing feeble and distraught, left the theater. The Interfax news agency identified him as a British citizen, but did not provide details. A woman and 3 children, believed to be Russians, were let out a few minutes later. Other well-known public and political figures such as Aslam Kazlakhanov, Irina Karkamada, Ruslan Kazbulatov, Boris Nemtsov and Grigory Yavlinsky took part in negotiations with the hostage-takers. Ex-president of the Soviet Union Mikhail Gorbachev also announced his willingness to act as an intermediary in the course of negotiations. Militants also demanded that representatives of the International Red Cross and Médecins Sans Frontières come to the theater to lead negotiations. FSB Colonel Konstantin Vasiliev attempted to enter the patio of the theater, but was shot at while approaching the building and forced to retreat. According to the FSB, 39 hostages were set free by the terrorists on the 24th of October 2002, but they repeated via one of the hostages an earlier threat to start shooting their captives if Russia failed to take their demands seriously. Negotiations on the release of non-Russian nationals were conducted by various embassies and the Chechens promised to release all foreign hostages. The kidnappers claimed they were ready to release 50 Russian hostages if Akhmet Kadyrov, head of Chechnya's pro-Moscow administration, would come to the theater, but Kadyrov did not respond, and the release did not take place. A hot water pipe had burst overnight and was flooding the ground floor. The hostage-takers called the flooding a provocation, and no agreement had been reached on having the pipe repaired, the FSB spokesman said. It later turned out that the sewer system was used by the Russian special forces for listening purposes. Day 3, the 25th of October. During the next day, the following people took part in negotiations with the militants: journalists Anna Politkovskaya, Sergei Govorikin and Mark Franchetti, and public figures Yevgeny Primakov, Ruslan Alshev and again Aslan Kazlakanov. The terrorists demanded negotiation with an official representative of Vladimir Putin. Relatives of the hostages staged anti-war demonstrations outside the theater and in central Moscow. The guerrillas agreed to release 75 foreign citizens in the presence of diplomatic representatives of their states. 15 Russian citizens were released, including 8 children. After a meeting with Putin, the FSB head Nikolai Patrushev offered to spare the lives of the Chechens if they released the remaining hostages unharmed. A group of Russian doctors, including Leonid Roshul, head of the Medical Center for Catastrophes, entered the theater to bring medicine for the hostages and said the terrorists were not beating or threatening their captives. He said most of the hostages were calm and that only 2 or 3 of the hostages were hysterical. Some hot food, warm clothes and medicine had also been taken in by the Red Cross. NTV channel journalists recorded an interview with Movsar Barayev, in which he sent a message to the Russian government. We have nothing to lose. We have already covered 2,000 kilometers by coming here. There is no way back. We have come to die. Our motto is freedom and paradise. We already have freedom as we've come to Moscow. Now we want to be in paradise. He also said the group had come to Moscow not to kill the hostages or to fight with Russia's elite troops, as they had had enough fighting in Chechnya over the years. We came here with a specific aim, to put an end to the war, and that is it. At 9:55 p.m., 4 hostages were released, bringing the total number of hostages that were set free on this day to 19. Gennady Vlak. After dusk, a man identified as Gennady Vlak ran across the square and gained entry to the theater. He said that his son was among the hostages, but his son did not seem to be present and the man was led away and shot by the Chechens. There is considerable confusion surrounding this incident, and Vlak's body was cremated before it was identified. Denis Gribkov. Around midnight, a gunfire incident took place as Denis Gribkov, a 30-year-old male hostage, ran over the backs of theater seats toward the female insurgents who were sitting next to a large improvised explosive device. A male Chechen shot at him and missed, but stray bullets hit and severely wounded Tamara Starkova and fatally wounded Pavel Zakharov, who were evacuated from the building soon after. Gribkov was removed from the auditorium and later found dead from gunshot wounds. Morning of the 26th of October. During the night, Ahmed Zakhayev, of Chechen envoy and associate of the separatist President Aslan Maskhadov, appealed to the extremists and asked them to refrain from rash steps. The Chechens told the BBC that a special representative of President Putin planned to come to the theater for talks the next day. 2 members of the Spetsnaz Alpha group moving around in the no-man's land were seriously wounded by a grenade fired from the building by the terrorists, which was blamed by the Moscow police chief Vladimir Pronin on the media news leak. According to an officer in the Russian Special Forces cited by The Guardian, the leak was controlled. We leaked the information that the storming would take place at 3 in the morning. The Chechen fighters were on their guard. They began shooting, but there was no raid. Then there was the natural reaction, a relaxation. And at 5 a.m., we stormed the place. Special Forces raid early Saturday morning, the 26th of October, forces from Russia's Spetsnaz from the FSB, with the assistance of the Russian Ministry of Internal Affairs SOBR unit, surrounded and stormed the theater. All were heavily armed and masked. Deputy Interior Minister Vladimir Vasilyev stated that the raid was prompted by a panic among the captives due to the execution of 2 female hostages. The raid was planned shortly after the hostages were initially seized, and the shooting cited as a proximate cause had occurred about 3 hours before the operation began. Chemical attack early in the morning before dawn, at around 5 a.m. Moscow time, the searchlights that had been illuminating the main entrance to the theater went out. Inside, although many hostages at first took the gas to be smoke from a fire, it soon became apparent to gunmen and hostages alike that a mysterious gas had been pumped into the building. Different reports said it came either through the specially created hole in the wall, that it was pumped through the theater's ventilation system, or that it emerged from beneath the stage. The security services pumped an aerosol anesthetic, later stated by Russian Health Minister Yuri Shevchenko to be based on phenytoin, into the theater through the air conditioning system. The discovery caused panic in the auditorium. Hostage Anna Andrianova, a correspondent for Moskvskaya Pravda, called Echo of Moscow radio studio and told on air in a live broadcast interview that the government forces had begun an operation by pumping gas into the hall. Assault. The Chechens, some of whom were equipped with gas masks, responded by firing blindly at the Russian positions outside. After 30 minutes, when the gas had taken effect, a physical assault on the building commenced. The combined forces entered through numerous building openings, including the roof, the basement, and finally the front door. When the shooting began, the terrorists told their hostages to lean forward in the theater seats and cover their heads behind the seats. Hostages reported that some people in the audience fell asleep, and some of the gunmen put on respirators. As the terrorists and hostages alike began to fall unconscious, several of the female terrorists made a dash for the balcony but passed out before they reached the stairs. They were later found shot dead. 2 of the Alpha group were also overcome by the gas. After nearly 1.5 hours of sporadic gun battles, the Russian special forces blew open the doors to the main hall and poured into the auditorium. In a fierce firefight, the Federals killed most of the guerrillas, both those still awake and those who had succumbed to the gas. According to the Russian government, fighting between the troops and the still conscious Chechen fighters continued in other parts of the building for another 30 minutes to 1 hour. Initial reports stated that 3 terrorists were captured alive and 2 of them managed to escape. Later, the government claimed that all hostage-takers had been killed in the storming. Alpha Team troops said that, "This is our first successful operation for years." Moskvskij Komsomolets cited a Russian Special Forces operative saying that, "If it were a usual storming, we'd have had 150 casualties among our men, added to the hostages," although the seriousness of these claims have never been verified. Evacuation. At 7 a.m., rescuers began carrying the bodies of hostages out of the building. Bodies were laid in rows on the foyer and the pavement at the main entrance to the TC, unprotected from falling rain and snow. None of the bodies witnessed by the Guardian correspondent had bullet wounds or showed signs of bleeding, but their faces were waxy, white and drawn, their eyes open and blank. Shortly, the entire space was filled with bodies of the dead and those unconscious from the gas but still alive. Ambulances were standing by and ordinary city buses were brought in. Medical workers were expecting to treat victims of explosions and gunfire, but not a secret chemical agent. The drug naloxone counteracts the chemical agent's effects, but would have to have been administered by rescue workers immediately. Some reports said the drug was used to save some hostages. The bodies of dead hostages were put in 2 buses which were parked at the TC. Initial reports said nothing about casualties among the hostages. The Crisis HQ representatives went to College Hall, where relatives of the hostages had been waiting, and told him that allegedly there were no fatalities among the hostages. The first official report of fatalities among the hostages came at about 9 a.m. At 1 p.m., Vasiliev announced at a press conference a definitive death toll of 67 hostages, who he said were killed by Chechens, but again said no children nor foreigners were among those killed. Armed guards were posted at the hospitals where victims were taken, and doctors were ordered not to release any of the theater patients in case militants had concealed themselves among the hostages. The hostages' family members panicked as the government refused to release any information about which hospitals their loved ones had been taken to, or even whether their relatives were among the dead. The official number of the dead rose to 90, including 25 children, while it was still claimed that the final attack was provoked by the terrorists executing their captives. Later the same day, the official death toll among hostages had risen to at least 118, and the officials had not specified exactly what killed them. By the 28th of October, of the 646 former hostages who remained hospitalized, 150 were still in intensive care and 45 were in critical condition. 73 hostages were rendered no medical aid. There were several Chechens among the hostages, and it may be that some of them were not treated because of their Chechen names. Money and other valuables belonging to the victims vanished. Official reports stated that the valuables were stolen by an FSB officer who was later killed in a car crash. The Russian authorities initially maintained that none of the deaths among the hostages occurred through poisoning. They spoke of health problems that were exacerbated by the 3-day ordeal with very little food or water, or indeed, medical attention.